The Galactic Council chose war at sunrise. Humanity had already prepared. The vote was not close. Of the 41 recognized species seated within the Continuum Assembly, the governing body that had managed interstellar affairs for 11,000 years, 37 cast their markers in favor of Directive Sigma 9. The directive was simple in language, catastrophic in implication. The newly discovered civilization dwelling on the third planet of the Sol system would be classified as a Tier 0 threat. A species deemed too volatile, too uncoordinated, and too unpredictably dangerous to be permitted further expansion beyond their own solar boundary. Tier 0 classification carried automatic enforcement authority, which, in the language of the Continuum, meant war. The session concluded at 0400 hours Sol relative time. Sunrise on Earth's eastern seaboard. What the Continuum did not know, what none of the 37 voting species had adequately calculated, was that humanity had been watching the Assembly's deliberations for 11 months. The first signal intercept had come through a deep space relay station the humans called Meridian 7, positioned at the heliopause where the solar wind met the interstellar medium. It was not a military installation. It had been built by the European Space Agency and the Indian Space Research Organization jointly, as part of a decade-long program to study interstellar particle flow. What it detected instead, in the spring of 2091, was structured electromagnetic variants embedded inside what appeared to be naturally occurring pulsar echoes. A deliberate signal, bounced off the magnetosphere of a brown dwarf 40 light-years distant, carrying encoded information at a rate no natural phenomenon could produce. Dr. Yemi Adeyemi, a Nigerian astrophysicist stationed at the Meridian 7 Monitoring Center in Lagos, was the first human to recognize the pattern. She did not panic. She did not leak the information. She filed an internal report, encrypted it to the highest civilian classification, and sent it up the chain through proper channels. It took 3 days to reach the UN's newly formed Office of Extraterrestrial Intelligence Assessment, commonly called OEIA. The OEIA had existed for 6 years without a single noteworthy event. Its director, a former U.S. Air Force Signals Intelligence officer named General Priya Mehta, read Dr. Adeyemi's report at 2 a.m. and did not sleep again for 4 days. The signal was not a greeting. It was not a transmission directed at Earth. It was internal Continuum communications traffic, bureaucratic correspondence between Assembly members about an upcoming formal session. The humans had, entirely by accident, intercepted the galactic equivalent of diplomatic cable traffic. General Mehta made the decision that would define the next decade of human history. She told no one outside a circle of 12 individuals, and she began building a translation framework. By the time the Continuum voted on Directive Sigma 9 11 months later, the OEIA's Linguistics Division, staffed by 43 of Earth's most accomplished computational linguists, xenolinguistics theorists and cryptographers, had achieved an 83% translation confidence rating on the primary Continuum language structure. Not perfect, not fluent, but enough to understand intent. Enough to know what the vote was about. Enough to know that the vote was coming. The humans had read the Continuum's internal memos. They had watched the debate unfold across dozens of intercepted transmissions. They had observed, with growing clarity, the central argument being made against humanity's continued existence as a free civilization, that a species which had gone from animal to interplanetary in a mere 100,000 years, a blink by galactic standards, was statistically likely to become a destabilizing force. That argument was not entirely wrong, and the analysts at OEIA knew it. But the conclusion drawn from it, preemptive suppression rather than contact, isolation rather than introduction, told humanity something important about the Continuum. Something that General Mehta included in a classified briefing to the UN Security Council 3 weeks before the vote. They are not malicious. They are afraid. And fear, in my experience, makes for poor strategy. The Security Council session lasted 9 hours. Representatives from China, the United States, the African Union, Brazil, the European Federation, and the newly formed Pacific Sovereignty Bloc all sat in a chamber that had been swept for surveillance devices twice in the preceding 48 hours. The debate inside that room was not about whether to fight. It was about whether fighting was even the appropriate framework. China's representative, Admiral Chen Wei, put it plainly, "We are not in a position to contest 41 species militarily. Our fleet assets are credible within this solar system. Beyond it we have reach but not depth. Any conventional confrontation in open space is a losing proposition." The Brazilian delegate, Dr. Sofia Nunes, agreed. Conventional. That's the operative word. What followed was a strategic planning session unlike anything in human history. Not because of what was decided, but because of how calmly it was decided. There was no panic. There was disagreement, some of it heated. But there was also a shared understanding that had been building for 11 months. The humans had information the Continuum did not know they had. That asymmetry was the only real advantage they possessed, and it would evaporate the moment it was used carelessly. The plan that emerged was not a battle plan. It was a posture, a layered, deliberate strategic architecture built around a single core principle. Make the cost of Directive Sigma 9's enforcement so uncertain, so potentially catastrophic, that the Continuum would be forced to recalculate. Not because humanity could defeat the Continuum, but because the Continuum couldn't be sure they couldn't. The vote came through at 0400 Earth time. The OEIA's translation system flagged it within minutes. General Meta received the notification on her personal device, read the summary and set it face down on her desk. She picked up the direct line to the UN Secretary General. "It passed," she said. 37-4. A pause on the other end. "Then we begin," the Secretary General said. Outside the Lagos Monitoring Center, the sun was just beginning to rise over the Atlantic. It painted the water in shades of amber and copper, the way it had for 4 billion years before the first human ever looked up at the stars and wondered what looked back. They were still wondering. But now they had a much better idea. And they had been preparing for this sunrise for almost a year. The plan had a name, Protocol Dawnline. It was not a declaration of war. It was not a defensive perimeter in any conventional sense. It was something more precise, a strategic communication sent not through radio waves or diplomatic channels, but through observable action. Through the careful, deliberate arrangement of human assets in ways that any sufficiently advanced civilization would recognize as meaningful. The Continuum's enforcement mechanism for Directive Sigma 9 was not expected to arrive quickly. Interstellar deployment, even for a multi-species alliance with advanced propulsion, required logistics. The OEIA's analysts, working from intercepted traffic, estimated between 14 and 22 months before any Continuum fleet element could be positioned within the outer Sol system. That window was everything. Humanity's space infrastructure in 2091 was more substantial than most people knew. The decades following the first expansion, the period between 2041 and 2075 when asteroid mining, lunar industrialization, and Martian colonization had reshaped Earth's economic and geopolitical landscape, had produced something the early space pioneers had not quite anticipated: genuine industrial capacity beyond Earth's atmosphere. The figures, classified at multiple levels, were quietly staggering. Humanity had 47 crewed installations beyond low Earth orbit. 12 were research stations. 8 were mining operations. 4 were dedicated shipyards. The rest were a mixture of relay hubs, fuel depots, and colony support facilities spread across the inner system, the asteroid belt, and 2 of Jupiter's moons. The combined military fleet, assets belonging to the Earth Defense Coordination Force, formed in 2079 after the brief but clarifying Martian governance crisis, consisted of 61 combat-rated vessels. Not warships in the traditional sense. Most had been designed with dual-use doctrine in mind, vessels that could support deep space operations, enforce exclusion zones, and if necessary deliver kinetic payloads at velocities that made the distinction between a mining slug and a weapon somewhat academic. 61 ships against the Continuum's presumed hundreds. Against species that had been operating in space for millennia. The numbers were not encouraging looked at directly. General Meta preferred not to look at them directly. The Continuum's strategic calculus, she explained to the joint planning session, held in a secure facility beneath the Swiss Alps 2 days after the vote, is built on a fundamental assumption, that we don't know they're coming. That we're a pre-contact civilization, unaware of their existence, with no time to prepare a coherent response. She let that settle. We've had 11 months. Let's talk about what 11 months buys you when you know what's coming and you're willing to move resources. Protocol Dawnline had 4 components. The first was transparency through visibility. Rather than hiding Earth's military assets, they would be repositioned in ways that were deliberately observable to any deep space sensor platform. Not in a defensive cluster around Earth that would communicate fear. Instead, spread across the system in a pattern that suggested confidence, presence, the posture of a civilization that expected to be engaged, not ambushed. The second component was denial architecture, the seeding of the outer system with autonomous sensor weapon platforms. Small, difficult to detect, powered by long-duration isotope cells. Not capable of stopping an invasion fleet. Capable of making the approach vectors unpredictable, of forcing any incoming force to spend time and resources clearing lanes rather than simply arriving. Time was the resource humanity needed most. The third component was communication ambiguity. Rather than broadcasting a clear message to the continuum, humanity would broadcast nothing. Silence at this stage was more unsettling than noise. A civilization that had detected surveillance and chosen not to respond was a civilization with reasons for its silence. The continuum strategist would have to account for what those reasons might be. The fourth component was the one that had generated the most debate in the planning sessions. Demonstration. The demonstration had to be real. It had to be observable. And it had to communicate capability without triggering an acceleration of the continuum's timeline. The solution came from an unexpected quarter. Dr. Adeyemi, the astrophysicist who had first detected the continuum's signals, had been brought into the OEIA's core planning group after her translation contributions proved essential. She was not a strategist. She was not a military officer. But she understood physics in a way that the military planners didn't, and she saw the problem differently. "You don't need to show them a weapon," she said, during a planning session that had been running for 6 hours. "You need to show them a capability. Something that demonstrates you understand the relevant physics of interstellar conflict and have made deliberate choices about how to apply it." The capability she proposed was elegant in its simplicity. Humanity had, as a byproduct of the asteroid mining industry, developed the ability to alter the trajectories of objects ranging from 10 meters to several kilometers in diameter. The equipment existed. The expertise existed. It had been used commercially for years to redirect iron-rich asteroids toward processing facilities in the belt. What Dr. Adeyemi proposed was to use that same capability, visibly, deliberately, in a way that would be detectable to any deep space observation platform, to reposition a series of large carbonaceous asteroids into new orbits. Orbits that, to a military-minded observer, would look very much like prepared munitions. They weren't. The asteroids were inert. The new orbits were stable and posed no actual threat. But they would look, to anyone watching from the outer system, like a civilization that had taken a significant portion of its available mass and arranged it into something that could be released toward incoming vectors. It would look like preparation. The first asteroid was redirected on a Tuesday morning, local Earth time. A mining tug registered to the Ceres Extraction Consortium, under classified contract to the EDCF, executed a 12-hour burn sequence that adjusted the trajectory of a 340-meter carbonaceous body designated CB2091-17. The second followed 4 days later. The third a week after that. Over the following 8 months, 11 such objects were repositioned. The work was unglamorous, slow, and technically demanding. It involved hundreds of personnel across multiple corporations and government agencies, all working under classification regimes that compartmentalized knowledge to the point where most of the people doing the work didn't fully understand what they were contributing to. From Earth's surface, the repositioning of 11 asteroids was not visible to the naked eye. To a civilization with long-range deep space sensors, watching the Sol system with the attention they devoted to it over the past several years, it was unmistakable. A species that knew it was being watched. A species that had responded not with panic or diplomacy, but with deliberate, methodical repositioning of strategic assets. A species that was sending a message in the only language that crosses cultural boundaries without translation. "We see you, we understand what is happening, and we have been working." The Continuum's Advanced Observation Platform, a passive sensor array positioned near the heliopause, registered the first asteroid repositioning 3 weeks after it occurred. The observation was transmitted back to the assembly. The debate that followed lasted 11 days. Sector Commander Vrath of the Hegemony Fleet had reviewed 43 first contact enforcement actions in their career. 43 civilizations brought under continuum jurisdiction, some willingly, some not. The process was well established. The variables were known. The outcomes were, with some variance, predictable. The Sol system was not behaving predictably. Vrath reviewed the sensor data from their advanced platform for the 6th time, seated in the forward observation deck of the Persistence of Order, the fleet's command vessel, currently decelerating at the edge of the Oort cloud. The data was the same each time. The interpretation was what continued to trouble them. The third planet's inhabitants had moved 11 large mass objects into configurations that served no commercial or scientific purpose. The vectors were wrong for orbital mechanics research. The positioning was wrong for resource extraction. But they aligned, when plotted against standard fleet approach corridors, with a pattern that Vratha's tactical analysis systems labeled, with uncomfortable specificity, as mass interdiction preparation. The small species had set up what appeared to be a defensive minefield. With asteroids, it was objectively crude. The hegemony fleet had countermeasures that could neutralize such objects at range. The asteroids themselves were not particularly dangerous. Their velocities would require significant additional propulsion to become effective kinetic threats, and the humans' propulsion systems were not, by continuum standards, impressive. But that wasn't what troubled Vrath. What troubled Vrath was the implication. A civilization capable of conceiving of this strategy, even an improvised, imperfect version of it, was not the frightened, unaware species the Assembly's intelligence assessments had described. The assessments had characterized humanity as a volatile but primitive civilization, likely to respond to continuum contact with confusion, religious crisis, or destructive panic. Nothing about the asteroid repositioning suggested panic. It suggested planning. Vrath filed their concern through the standard command channel. The response from the Assembly's Strategic Directorate came back in 72 hours, a duration that, given the distances involved, indicated the message had been prepared before the inquiry was fully processed. The response was dismissive. The Strategic Directorate's analysis held that the asteroid repositioning was coincidental, a continuation of commercial mining operations that happened to align with defensive vectors by chance. The humans, the Directorate maintained, could not know about Directive Sigma 9. Their communication systems were inadequate to have intercepted Assembly traffic. The pattern was pareidolia, the observer finding intention in randomness. Vrath read the response twice, then set it aside. They did not believe the Directorate's conclusion. But they were a military officer, not a policy maker, and their orders were clear. Proceed to enforcement positioning, initiate the standard contact suppression protocol, and await further instruction. So they proceeded. But they also filed a secondary report, a personal observation, technically optional under fleet regulations, noting their reservations and requesting that the Directorate reconsider the intelligence assessment. The secondary report was acknowledged and filed. No action was taken. Aboard Meridian 7, now serving as humanity's primary intercept station, Dr. Adeyemi's team had been monitoring the hegemony fleet's deceleration signature for 6 weeks. The mathematics of the fleet's approach was not difficult. Any civilization capable of building deep space observation platforms could track an object decelerating from interstellar velocities. The thermal signature alone was visible across a broad spectrum. The fleet was large. Humanity's best estimate, between 30 and 50 vessels, varying in size from what appeared to be destroyer class to something considerably larger. One vessel, based on its thermal output and estimated mass, was in a category the EDCF analysts had labeled simply as command class. It was 3 times the size of the largest human-built spacecraft. The data was shared in real time with the UN Security Council and the EDCF Joint Command. It produced exactly the response General Mehta had prepared for: steady, focused attention. Not paralysis. She had spent considerable effort, over the preceding months, ensuring that the people in those decision-making positions had been given time to absorb the reality of the situation gradually. 11 months of incremental intelligence sharing, careful briefings, controlled leaks of information to the civilian leadership, had produced a political class that was frightened but functional. Leaders who had had time to process the impossible, that humanity was not alone, and that the neighbors had just decided they were a problem, and arrive at something resembling strategic clarity. Was not a guarantee. Humans under sufficient pressure made poor decisions. Mehta knew that. She had built redundancies into every protocol to account for it. But so far the decision-making had held. The moment that changed the dynamic came not from a military event, but from a communication. 17 days before the hegemony fleet reached the outer boundary of the Sol system, the point at which, according to intercepted fleet communications, the formal contact suppression action was scheduled to begin, a new signal appeared in the continuum's traffic. It originated not from the fleet, not from the Assembly. It came from one of the 4 dissenting species, the ones who had voted against Directive Sigma 9. The translation, when OEIA's linguistics team processed it, was imperfect. But the meaning was clear enough. The dissenting species, designated by humanities analysts as Species Rho, a civilization based in a system approximately 60 light-years from Sol, had filed a formal objection with the Assembly. Not about the vote. The vote was done. Their objection was procedural. Directive Sigma 9 required, under continuum law, that an enforcement action be preceded by a formal notification to the subject civilization. Contact, in other words, before suppression. Continuum law, assembled over thousands of years of dealing with emerging civilizations, had, buried within its enforcement protocols, a requirement that the civilization being targeted be informed of the directive before action was taken. not necessarily given a choice, but informed. The directive's architects had almost certainly never imagined a scenario in which the target civilization had already read the directive themselves. But the requirement stood. Species Rho was invoking it. And under continuum law, the enforcement action could not legally proceed until notification had occurred. The hegemony fleet received the legal hold order and halted its approach at the system's edge. Aboard the Persistence of Order, Sector Commander Vrath read the hold order and experienced something they rarely allowed themselves: quiet, private relief. Time. There was now time. Time in which something other than force might occur. Vrath still did not know how much the humans understood. But they were becoming more certain with each passing review of the sensor data that the answer was more than the Directorate believed. In the OEIA facility in Lagos, when the hegemony fleet's deceleration halt was confirmed, Dr. Adeyemi quietly closed the sensor window on her workstation, stood up and went to the window. Outside, the city was going about its morning. Traffic, voices, the smell of rain on warm pavement. No one down there knew. Not yet. But they had just been given more time, by a species 60 light-years away who had voted against the violence. Sometimes, Adeyemi thought, the universe surprised you. The notification came through at 3:17 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, on a frequency that should not have been accessible to human receivers. It arrived as a directed beam, narrowband high precision, aimed at Earth with a specificity that made clear the sender knew exactly where the planet was and roughly where its inhabited surface was concentrated. The signal carried a redundancy-encoded message in 17 different compression architectures, as if the sender was uncertain which format the recipients could process and had elected to include all of them. It was, in the language of interstellar communication, the equivalent of knocking loudly and clearly, while also leaving a note under the door. The OEIA translation system processed it in 40 minutes. General Meta had the preliminary translation in her hands within the hour. The message was formal, almost bureaucratic in structure. It identified itself as an official communication from the Galactic Continuum Assembly to the dominant governance entities of the Sol 3 civilization. It stated, with procedural precision, that Sol 3 had been designated under Directive Sigma 9 as a Tier 0 developmental concern. It outlined in general terms what that designation meant. It noted that continuum enforcement assets were currently positioned at the outer boundary of the Sol system. And then, at the end, in a section that the translation system flagged as stylistically distinct from the rest of the message, possibly authored differently, there was a single additional line. This notification is provided pursuant to Assembly Statute 7.4.1. The subject civilization is permitted a period of no less than 30 standard cycles to respond through any available channel before enforcement action commences. 30 standard cycles. Based on the best estimates of the continuum's time measurement conventions, that translated to approximately 42 Earth days. 6 weeks. The Security Council session that convened 12 hours after the notification's receipt was the most consequential meeting in human history, and General Meta had prepared for it with the same meticulous attention she'd applied to everything else over the past year. She began with what they knew, presented without drama. They knew the Continuum was a multi-species governing body with thousands of years of operational history. They knew it had an internal legal structure that had, through the efforts of a dissenting member species, created this window. They knew the hegemony fleet was real, credibly large, and positioned at the system's edge. They knew that the fleet's commander had filed a dissenting report about human preparedness, a detail gleaned from intercepted fleet communications, which suggested at least one military officer on the other side was approaching the situation with more caution than the Assembly's civilian leadership. They also knew that 4 species had voted against the directive. That was not a trivial fact. In a 41-member body, 4 dissenters represented a real minority. It suggested the continuum was not monolithic in its assessment of humanity. "We have 6 weeks to change the vote," Meta said. "Not militarily. Diplomatically." The room was quiet. "We respond to the notification," she continued. "We respond formally through every available channel in a way that demonstrates we received the message, understood it, and have a considered reply. We use that reply to establish 3 things: that we are not what they think we are, that we are aware of the internal dissent within the Assembly, and that conflict will not achieve what they hope it will achieve." China's Admiral Chen leaned forward. "You're proposing negotiation with a civilization that just declared war on us. I'm proposing communication with a civilization that, legally, had to tell us it declared war on us before doing anything about it. Those are different situations." The human response to the Continuum's notification took 11 days to compose. It was a collaborative document, drafted by a team of 47 people. Diplomats, linguists, physicists, historians, philosophers, and notably Dr. Adeyemi, working in rotating shifts across 3 secure facilities on 2 continents. The translation into the primary continuum language format consumed another 4 days, and the quality checking process added 3 more. The document ran to approximately 6,000 words in its primary form. What it said, stripped of formality and diplomatic architecture, was this: "We received your message. We have been aware of the Assembly's deliberations for 11 months. We understand the nature of Directive Sigma 9 and the reasoning behind it. We do not contest the Assembly's concern about rapid civilizational expansion, because it is a reasonable concern. We contest the proposed resolution, because suppression of a civilization that has demonstrated no hostile intent, whose entire expansion history has been driven by curiosity and necessity, not aggression, is not a proportionate or legally sound response. We note that 4 Assembly members voted against this directive. We invite dialogue with those members, and with any others who share their reservations. We are aware that your fleet is at the edge of our system. We want to be transparent. We are also aware of the fleet commander's internal communications expressing reservations about the intelligence assessment used to justify this action. We are not sharing this to threaten or embarrass. We are sharing it to demonstrate that our monitoring capabilities are more developed than your assessment indicated, and to suggest that other elements of that assessment may also require revision. We are not asking for protection. We are not asking for membership. We are asking for the thing your own legal code already requires: genuine contact before any other action is taken. We are here. We are listening. And we have been ready for this conversation longer than you know." The message was transmitted on the same frequency the notification had arrived on, with the same narrow-beam precision that made clear humanity had already reverse-engineered the transmission geometry. It arrived at the Hegemony Fleet's command vessel 18 hours later. Sector Commander Vrath read it alone in their quarters without staff present. They read it twice. Then they requested a private channel to the Assembly's diplomatic division and spent 4 hours in conversation with officials whose names would not appear in any public record. At the end of that conversation, Vrath sent a 1-line message to the fleet's tactical division: "Maintain current position. Do not adjust approach vectors." It was not a retreat, but it was not an advance. In the 42-day window that humanity had been given, something was happening that the architects of Directive Sigma 9 had not fully accounted for. The humans were not behaving like a civilization caught off guard. They were behaving like a civilization that had been preparing for a conversation. And that, to the 4 dissenting species watching from 60 light-years away, was exactly the kind of evidence that made their position within the Assembly worth defending. The species humanities analysts had designated Species Rho called themselves, in their own language, something that translated approximately as the persistent. They were approximately 900 years into their membership of the Continuum, which made them relative newcomers by Assembly standards, but established enough to command procedural respect. Their civilization occupied a binary star system, 2 mid-sequence stars in a slow gravitational dance, around which 3 habitable worlds had evolved separately and been gradually unified into a single interstellar polity over 6 centuries of careful diplomacy. They were not a warlike species. They were not a passive one either. They had, in their 900 years of Continuum membership, been involved in 3 significant interspecies disputes, always on the side of procedural resolution over force. They had voted against Directive Sigma 9 for reasons they stated openly in the Assembly record. The evidence supporting Tier 0 classification was insufficient. The risk assessment was extrapolated from historical analogues that did not adequately account for Sol 3's specific trajectory. And the precedent of preemptive suppression, applied to a civilization that had made no hostile contact, was legally and ethically troubling. The other 3 dissenting species had their own reasons. Species Delta, humanity's designation for a civilization in a system 32 light-years from Sol, had been through a contact suppression action themselves, 3,000 years earlier. They had been the target, not the enforcer. Their memory of that period was long and specific. They had survived it, been brought into the Continuum, and spent the subsequent millennia as reliable but quietly resentful members of the Assembly. They voted against Directive Sigma 9 because they knew what it felt like from the other side, and because their civilization's history held the answer to the Continuum's core question about rapid civilizational expansion. It was dangerous, yes, but suppression didn't make it less dangerous. It only changed the timeline. Species Gamma was a methodological outlier within the Assembly, a civilization of scientists who had spent 4,000 years cataloging every first contact action in continuum history and building predictive models for their outcomes. Their models, they had presented to the assembly in a formal briefing 3 months before the vote, showed that preemptive suppression actions had a 31% rate of producing long-term escalation rather than compliance. Their vote against Directive Sigma 9 was not emotional. It was statistical. Species Epsilon was the most interesting dissenter from humanity's analytical perspective. They were one of the oldest species in the assembly, with a continuum membership that stretched back nearly 4,000 years, and they voted against the directive for a reason they did not fully articulate in the public record. The OEIA's analysts, working from intercepted communications, believed they had identified the real reason. Species Epsilon had been monitoring Sol 3 independently, for reasons unrelated to the directive, for approximately 200 years. They knew more about human civilization than any other assembly member. And whatever they had observed in those 2 centuries had led them to a private conclusion that was at odds with the Directorate's threat assessment. What that conclusion was exactly remained unclear. But it was significant enough to produce a dissenting vote from a species that had not dissented in assembly proceedings for 800 years. The message that humanity's response had generated within the assembly was not public. Assembly deliberations at this level were sealed under Continuum Security Protocol, and the OEIA's interception of communications traffic had significant gaps at the distances involved. But what fragments came through painted a picture of a body that was, for the first time in the directive's history, facing organized internal challenge. Species Rho had formally petitioned for an emergency review session. Species Gamma had filed supplementary analysis challenging the threat assessment methodology. Species Delta had invoked an ancient procedural mechanism, one that had not been used in recorded history, that required any enforcement action with a legal hold to be re-voted before proceeding, rather than simply resuming after the hold expired. Species Epsilon had said nothing publicly. But a private communication between one of their senior diplomats and an assembly legal official had been intercepted, and when translated, contained a phrase that Dr. Adeyemi flagged immediately. The humans demonstrated awareness of the observation timeline. That is inconsistent with the intelligence baseline. The baseline must be revised before we proceed. It was, in diplomatic language, devastating to the case for Directive Sigma 9. If the intelligence assessment underlying the vote was materially wrong, if the species classified as Tier 0 was actually operating at a significantly higher level of awareness and capability than assessed, then the vote itself was built on faulty premises. Under continuum law, a vote based on materially false intelligence could be challenged. It had been done twice in assembly history. General Meta received the assessment of this internal assembly situation from her intelligence division on a Thursday morning. She read it standing at her desk, didn't sit down through the entire briefing document. When she finished, she made a decision she had been holding in reserve for weeks. She authorized the third component of Protocol Dawnline, a direct, private communication channel to Species Epsilon. The channel had been prepared months earlier, based on a careful analysis of Species Epsilon's independent monitoring activity. The OEIA had determined that Species Epsilon had their own deep space relay infrastructure positioned near Sol, separate from the Assembly's official sensor network. It was old infrastructure. By the electromagnetic signatures, some of it appeared to have been placed in position over a century ago, but it was active. A directed signal, aimed at Species Epsilon's nearest relay node, using the same narrowband transmission format the Continuum had used for its notification, carried the following. We know you have been watching for a long time. We would like to speak with you directly if that is possible. Not as a supplicant to an adjudicator. As one civilization to another. The message was brief by diplomatic standards. It contained no threats, no demands, no statement of capability. It contained something more valuable than any of those things. It demonstrated that humanity knew Species Epsilon existed as a distinct actor within the assembly, knew they had been monitoring Earth independently, and was choosing to approach them specifically. Not the assembly. Not the fleet. Not the 4 dissenters as a group. Just them. The response took 9 days. When it came, it was in a different encoding architecture than anything the OEIA had seen before, not the standard continuum format but something older and more complex. Species Epsilon's reply, translated across 4 days of intensive effort, began. We have been waiting to see if you would find us. You have. That tells us something. Species Epsilon sent a second message 6 days after their first. It was not a diplomatic communication. It was a data package, structured, indexed and organized with the precision of a scientific archive. The package took 11 hours to transmit and contained approximately 4 times more information than all previous continuum communications humanity had intercepted combined. The OEIA's Translation and Analysis Division worked on it in shifts for 3 weeks. What they found in that archive rewrote several foundational assumptions about human history. Species Epsilon had been monitoring Earth for 230 years. That much had already been suspected. But the archive scope went considerably further. Approximately 4,000 years ago, during a period when the continuum was considerably smaller and its enforcement protocols less developed, a continuum survey vessel had conducted a passive observation pass of the Sol system. At that time, Earth's most complex civilizations were early Bronze Age societies, city-states, agricultural communities, proto-writing systems. The survey's conclusion had been logged and filed. Sol 3 was a biologically rich world with pre-civilizational sapient development. Standard categorization, developmental observation, no action required. The survey was routine. It had been conducted on thousands of worlds. Most produced no subsequent action. What made Sol 3 unusual was what the survey recorded about the rate of development. The assessment noted, almost as a technical footnote, that the rate of social complexity increase over the previous 2,000 years was approximately 4.7 times the baseline expectation for the species' current biological stage. Was an outlier. Not unprecedented, but notable enough to flag for periodic reobservation. The periodic reobservation was assigned to species Epsilon, as part of their standard long-range monitoring responsibilities. They had been conducting that monitoring ever since. The archive contained their full observational record. 230 years of detailed data on human civilization, supplemented by access to the 4,000-year survey history. It was, from a scientific standpoint, an extraordinary document. From a human standpoint, it was something else entirely. The data showed, with the dispassionate precision of long-term scientific observation, the full trajectory of human civilization across 4 millennia, collapse cycles and recovery curves, the emergence and extinction of languages, the spread and revision of social architectures, technological acceleration that had genuinely surprised species Epsilon's analysts, not in its direction which they had predicted, but in its pace, which exceeded their models by a factor of approximately 2. The archive contained species Epsilon's internal debate 400 years ago about whether to initiate contact. The debate had gone on for 40 years. The conclusion, driven by a narrow consensus, was that the risk of disrupting the developmental trajectory outweighed the potential benefit of contact. So they continued to watch. There was a section of the archive devoted to the 20th century alone that was longer than everything preceding it. Species Epsilon had devoted extraordinary analytical resources to the period between 1900 and 2000, the century in which humanity had, in the span of 100 years, gone from powered flight to spaceflight, developed and then voluntarily constrained the most destructive weapons ever created, built global communication networks, and begun, tentatively, to establish institutions capable of coordinating planetary governance. The analyst's summary of that century, translated by the OEIA's team, was measured in language but unmistakable in implication. The title of the section was, in direct translation, The Compression Event. Their argument, supported by 4 centuries of observation, was that humanity was not developing at a normal rate. It was developing at a rate that their models categorized as exponential in the mathematical sense, acceleration of acceleration. Every generation building not just on the previous generation's achievements, but on an infrastructure of accumulated achievement that compounded the speed of further development. Species Epsilon's concern, and this was not the Assembly's concern, not the threat assessment in Directive Sigma 9, but the scientists' own conclusion after 2 centuries of watching, was that this rate of development was self-limiting in a very specific way. The compression would eventually encounter physical and social limits. The question that their analysts had been debating for a century was whether humanity would encounter those limits before or after they had developed the capacity to cause harm at interstellar scale. Their most recent models, updated to incorporate data through 2089, had a median answer to that question, before, with significant variance. But before. It was, in its way, a form of confidence in human civilization, grounded not in sentiment but in data. Dr. Adeyemi read the relevant sections of the archive 3 times. Then she did something that had not been part of any protocol. She wrote a personal message to the species Epsilon contact address that had been established through the relay network. It was not an official communication. She cleared it with General Mehta, who read it, was quiet for a moment and said, "Send it." The message was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph acknowledged the archive, thanked them in formal language for the depth and honesty of the data, noted that much of what the archive contained was consistent with humanity's own self-analysis, and that the sections which diverged from human self-understanding would require considerable time to process. The second paragraph was not formal at all. There is a question I need to ask, and I hope the translation carries the sincerity of it rather than just the words. You have watched us for 200 years. You have watched us make every mistake, fail every test, and then usually try again. After all of that, what do you think of us? Not as a threat assessment. Not as a developmental case study. What do you actually think? The response from Species Epsilon came back in 5 days. It was short, just 3 sentences in the original for in translation. We think you are very young. We think you are aware that you are young, which is rarer than you might expect. And we think the question you just asked is one that the Assembly should have asked before they voted. The archive was presented to the Security Council in a controlled briefing. The reaction varied. Some delegates were disturbed by the revelation that Earth had been under surveillance for centuries. Some were moved by the scope of the Species Epsilon record. A few were simply overwhelmed. But the analytical conclusion, the one that General Meta and her team drew from the combined data, was operationally significant in a way that cut through the emotional complexity. Species Epsilon's archive was evidence. Documented, multi-century, scientifically rigorous evidence that the threat assessment underlying Directive Sigma 9 was built on a 2-year observation window when a 4,000-year record was available. Evidence that the Continuum's own long-term monitor of Earth did not share the Assembly's conclusion. Evidence that the vote had been called with incomplete data, not through malice, but through a failure of information flow within the Assembly's own institutional structure. It was the kind of evidence that, in any legal system with procedural integrity, required the case to be reconsidered. Humanity's diplomatic team drafted a formal submission to the Assembly's legal division, incorporating the archive's most relevant sections, with Species Epsilon's explicit permission. The submission was filed with 7 days remaining in the 42-day window.